Hi friends! Thank you so much for being here today. Are you a beginner just trying to figure out this crazy medium called watercolor? It still surprises me every day. I'm going to show you the one exercise that I believe will have the biggest impact on your watercolor journey. It's no surprise that how much water we use determines everything about a watercolor painting. So let me show you this exercise that's practiced by watercolor artists all over the world, and then I'll explain why it's so important. I'm going to throw in a little bonus exercise at the end that I wish so badly I had known about when I first started watercolor. So grab a paintbrush and let's do this together. We're going to take one single paint color off of the palette and practice mixing it into different consistencies. Because in watercolor, the water to paint ratio in your mix is everything. It determines how light or dark your paint color is. It's critical when it comes to adding layers in paintings. Practicing this guarantees your watercolor skills will improve. So I'm just going to use the color indigo. You can use whatever color you'd like. I'd recommend starting with a darker color so that it's easier for you to see the differences. But you should eventually do this with many different colors just to get an idea, because all paint colors and all paint brands perform a little bit differently. So our first consistency is tea. So just imagine what a cup of tea looks like, and that's what we're going to make our paint look like. Very watery. So I'm going to grab just a little bit of indigo off my palette, add it here to my mixing dish, and bring over some water. So you can see how runny this is, how thin it is, just like tea. And I'm going to paint it in this box, and I'm purposely going to go over the pencil lines just so I can check the transparency. So obviously we can still see the pencil lines very clearly, so this is a very transparent value. Our next consistency is coffee. So coffee is just a little bit thicker and darker than tea. So I'm going to grab even more indigo off my palette and add it into the mix that I have here. And now I'll paint this area. You can see that it's still very runny and thin, but definitely darker than tea. And my pencil lines are still showing through, so this is still pretty transparent. So now we're going to move over to milk. And what I should have said back when we did tea is, when you're thinking about the ratio, if this helps you, think of tea as like 90% water, 10% paint. Coffee is 70% water, 30% paint. So milk, we're going to do maybe like 50-50. 50% paint, 50% water. So I'm going back into my indigo off my palette and adding it into my mix here. You can see the paint is starting to get thick. It's a little less runny than our previous mixtures. Now this is the first one where our pencil lines are not really showing through anymore. We're starting to get a lot darker. Now let's try to mix cream. So this is going to be 70% paint, 30% water. I'm going to grab even more indigo off my palette to thicken up this mixture that I have. I might even separate it a little bit to get some of the water out. So you can see this is getting much thicker. It doesn't bead up or run at all. It's very thick. It kind of stays in one place. It completely covers my pencil lines. But you can see just how dark and rich that is. And it was much more difficult to spread because it was thicker. And our final consistency is butter. Butter is paint straight off the palette or out of the tube. We don't want to add any water to it. So I'm actually going to clean my brush off, and I'm going to dry it by squeezing the bristles on my towel to make sure that my brush is just barely damp. Now my indigo is already a little wet because I've been dipping into it so much, so that will help me get the paint off, But other than that, I don't want to add any water. So I'm just trying to get a lot of this on my brush, and let's see what happens. It's so dry it won't even come off. Let me grab some more. So you can see that butter is so thick, it doesn't want to spread at all. And this is actually like a dry brush technique where it's leaving behind all these little white highlights, because without adding water to the paint, it's not going to flow and spread very well. So this is as thick as your paint can get. Now that we've done this, not only can you see so many different values that we get just from one paint color, but you've also got a better idea of how to mix your paint to get the color value that you want. It all comes down to paint consistency, or your paint to water ratio. The more you practice this with more colors, the more equipped you'll be to add these different values into your paintings. Now, we did all of this wet on dry. I encourage you to experiment with a little wet on wet as well. Put a wet patch down and put a tea consistency in it and see what happens. Do the same for milk and butter. See how the paint flows and spreads differently in the water. This exercise is important for many reasons. While doing it, you get familiar with your different paint colors and also how adding water to them changes their value. When you need a color in a particular value, light, medium, or dark, you'll know exactly how to get it. You get used to the feeling of having different consistencies of paint on your paintbrush, so you'll know what to expect from that brushstroke before your brush even hits the paper. It creates depth. Painting an entire piece in, say, a milk consistency is going to look dull and flat. Starting with a tea consistency and then adding some coffee on top, followed by some shadows and a cream consistency, will add so much interest and depth to your painting. Now here comes the bonus exercise. Taking what we've learned here, I'm going to show you something that will change everything about the way you paint. We're going to play with multiple consistencies of paint in one area. So let's start by taking a lighter consistency, like maybe coffee, so that it's easier to see. I've got to remix myself some coffee here because I had thickened it up so much. That's light enough, it could almost be tea. Here we go. And let's try dropping in some cream consistency paint. So this was my cream over here. I'm going to grab a little more indigo just to make sure it's thick, because it's actually behaving a lot more like milk, which is fine too. And I'm just going to drop it into my patch of coffee. Now you can see that the paint does not spread very far, but it does layer nicely on top of the base layer. And this is going to be different for different brands of paint and for different colors. Some tend to explode more in the water while others kind of hold their shape. But you can see that every brushstroke I'm making, yes, it's soft and fuzzy because it's wet on wet, but the colors still are layering nicely on top of each other. So let's try the same thing but backwards. I'm going to take a milk or cream consistency paint. Need a little more water than that. And I'm going to drop, like, let's say a coffee consistency into it. So you can see that this is starting to form some blooms. And blooms are one of the most difficult things that beginners struggle with. Sometimes we want them, but most of the time we want to avoid them or correct them. I do have a video on that I will link above, but now you can see that adding a thinner consistency of paint onto a thicker one is going to result in a bloom. So it's just another thing to keep in mind of how you can avoid a bloom. Make sure that when you're layering a thicker consistency of paint on top of a thinner one if you're doing the wet on wet technique. If you want to create a bloom, now you know how to make one. Meanwhile, this one is totally fine, no blooms. When I learned this, it seriously changed everything for me, especially with landscapes, painting clouds and things like that, wet on wet. What a huge difference having this knowledge makes. So I encourage you to practice this exercise as well with your different paint colors. You can even do 2 paint colors at once, but when you master this, your painting takes off to a whole new level. So as a warm-up exercise, or when you just don't know what to paint, grab a new paint color off your palette and practice making a scale for it from tea to butter. The future watercolor artist in you will thank you. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.